Well, welcome everybody in Europe. Hooray, indeed, Ed. Hey, Kara.
Hi.
Hey. Okay, great. So my name is Jason Grillo. I'm the event director for AirMiners. This is I wanted to say that you are privileged to be part of our first event where the speakers will be present in person today from Brussels, Belgium. So, très bien, as they may say. What we're going to do is I'm going to hand over to Karim the responsibilities for the rest of the event, but it's wonderful to see so many here on talking about European regulation. And I'll come on at the very tail end with a couple of AirMiners announcements, and we will go from there. So looking forward to the conversation. So Karim, please.
Hey, thanks, Jason. So I hope everyone can hear us well in this new hybrid format post-COVID. So hopefully it's a nice rendering. Glad to be here in Brussels at Bellona offices. So I'd like to thank Bellona, Europa, and Mark to host us for this panel. And we're going to have a session of 1 hour talking about CDR and CDR regulation, specifically in Europe in a wide geographic sense. So my name is Karim Rahmani. I'm a co-founder at a CDR startup called Carbon Impact, and I'll moderate this panel discussion. I'm very proud to have a number of experts and representatives working on CDR here, and I will let them introduce themselves. So maybe we can start by Fabien, who is attending remotely. So Fabien, if you could quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karim. And hello, everybody. I'm Fabien Ramos. I'm working at the European Commission in the Directorate for Climate Action. So I'm a policy officer that is looking and working at the certification of carbon removals. It's an initiative that the European Commission has announced 2 years ago. And this year is the year when we have to deliver this initiative. So at the end of the year, we'll come with an EU framework for the certification of carbon removal.
Great, thank you, Fabien. It's good to have you here on this important year, and then we have a timely, good timing for this discussion then right now. I turn back now to the room. So why don't we go around? Maybe Mark, you're hosting us. You could introduce yourself and Bellona.
Thank you, Karim. So I'm Mark Preston. I'm a policy advisor at Bellona Europa, which is an international NGO originally based in Norway, and we work here in the Brussels office on EU climate policy. We work a lot on hard to abate sectors, sort of heavy industry, long-range transport, that sort of issue. And recently starting to work on carbon dioxide removal. And we're working on some Horizon 2020 projects, looking at how to govern the implementation of carbon dioxide removal in the EU.
Okay, great. Turning to Eve, I think that's the way to call you, right, Eve?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Tamme, and I'm a managing director at Climate Principles. I've been working on climate policy since 2004, and for 15 years of those, I've been a policymaker. But most recently, I started my own advisory, and now I'm working with corporates, NGOs, and governments, and advising them on climate policy, more specifically looking at carbon dioxide removal and carbon markets. So that's my main focus.
Okay, thanks, Eli.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eli Mitchell-Larson. I'm the launch director at Carbon Gap. We are a relatively new NGO with a pan-European focus, exclusively focused on carbon removal, how to advance a cohesive policy framework for Europe that actually gets removals as part of the climate solution. I'm also an associate at Oxford Net Zero, and yeah, really pleased to be here in person, in the flesh, with people that I've met and worked with in the past, but I've never actually seen in person. So looking forward to the event.
Okay, great to have you, all panelists here in Brussels and part of us here in the office. Jason, just checking with you that audio is fine and video is fine before we move on. Yeah, everything is working well.
Yep, good. I can hear you well, and I can see you. I can see everybody as well. So all good.
Okay, Okay, so validating this hybrid format, apparently technically it's working, it's happening. Okay, so I suggest we start the discussion right now, and maybe we could, to ground the topic and go through some, vocabulary. So not always that exciting, but important to define what we're talking about. So it would be good to have a first discussion about what is exactly carbon removal and CDR. I know this audience of AirMiners, is an audience of, let's say, not experts, but people who are quite deep into the topic. But I think it's still good to ground a bit some basics to start the discussion. So maybe as a first question, I think everybody knows that the third working group of IPCC report has been issued this week, and I think CDR has a space in it. So maybe I will let you give us a thought, a flavor of what's the role of CDR and how do they define it in the latest IPCC report. So Eli, will you have a shot at this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, great news. The Working Group 3 report is out, so we almost never have to do the kind of debate over what the definition of CDR is again, at least not for a while, because it's very clearly placed in the report. So I think they define it as the anthropogenic removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, coupled with its durable storage into geological, biological, various different carbon sinks, including long-lived products. So I think the key thing to say there is that carbon removal is sort of two components. You can ask yourself two questions. Did the CO2 come from the air or perhaps the upper ocean, which is in equilibrium with the air? And did the carbon get stored in a way that's intended to be durable and long-lived? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, it's carbon removal. If the answer is no to either of them, it's not carbon removal. So it's really that simple. And actually, Eva was bringing up yesterday that they also included the sort of 3 use cases for removal in the IPCC report. So they're doing a lot of our work for us, and we can sort of just point to that for all future CDR events. In a sense.
Eva, maybe you can comment on these three uses or use cases for CDR.
Yeah, so I was looking at the new reports, not only with the eye of what's in there, but also what has changed compared to the previous report. So the previous assessment report is the 5th one that came out in 2014. But meanwhile, we had a few special reports, and of course, the most known one is the special report on 1.5 degrees. And there, actually, the definition was the same, but for some reason, it didn't get maybe as much attention. Hopefully, this one solidifies that this definition is really what we should use and go for. But what has changed is that in the special reports, CDR had kind of 2 main goals or objectives, and it was about balancing residual emissions when we get to net zero, and then drawing further down CO2 from the atmosphere to get to net negative emissions. So these 2 goals. What the new report has done is introduce and kind of structure and maybe rephrase these 2 goals a bit better and introduce a 3rd one. So now we have a new near-term goal or objective, and the near-term is about reducing the net emissions already now. So the net emissions, basically that's what it's doing near term. Then the mid-term is balancing residual emissions. And then the long-term goal is sustaining and increasing the negative emissions. So that's, I think, for those working on CDR and CDR advocacy, having these 3 distinct goals, especially this new one, is going to be used a lot, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so if I want to add some complexity in the discussion, does it mean that right now we can consider that CDR is a new form of offsets? Mark?
So I think if we follow the sort of 3 sequential steps that Eve just mentioned, that the IPCC is mentioning, where the first aim is to reduce net emissions, so to help accelerate the rate at which we stop harming the atmosphere, then carbon dioxide removal needs to happen on top of emission reductions. So this is the need for separate targets for emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal. This is where this sets in. And then at some point when there is this need to reach net zero, that is where the discussion about balancing some emissions with some removals gets into play. And so then we need to have a bit of a more complicated discussion about which emissions, which residual emissions can reliably need negative emissions to be able to call themselves net zero.
Okay, so I think we're still here. There will still be ample ways for debate and discussion about removal versus offsets, but this new report is bringing some clarity on the topic now, right, by clarifying the roles. So if I turn to you, Fabien, do you see how does the Commission look at maybe the latest IPCC report and the role of the definition of carbon removals versus some other tools in climate policy?
No, IPCC reports are really at the core of our policies and at DG Climat and well, at the European Commission in general. All climate policies are based on scientific evidence, and we are very much involved in the process also of this IPCC report. We are participating to the session on the agreement of the summary for policymakers, etc., etc. So this is essential, and we are very excited to look at again at new reports and to have this update on the state of science and modeling on that. Related to carbon removal, I just wanted to say that what I also like in this last report, because of course, yesterday or 2 days ago, there was this publication of the latest report of Working Group 3, but last year we had also the report of the Working Group 1 that so for people less expert, Working Group 1 is looking really at the physical science, what is happening in the atmosphere, on the carbon cycles, etc. And the Working Group 3 is looking at what we can put in place to reduce emissions, to increase removals, and more the technological aspects. And what I like this time is that these two reports are very much consistent. So when you look at the carbon removal solution addressed by the Working Group 1 and the Working Group 3, this is the same. There is a lot of consistency on that. It has not always been the case in the past, I'm very happy about that. And I think these two reports are really great source of information for carbon removal and will bring a lot of input for us when designing climate policies in Europe.
Okay, no, thanks. So still, I think, again, definitions are clearer and clearer, but today, so we're talking about CDR in a regulation context, but there's also a role for voluntary markets in promoting today the carbon removals and as well as some form of carbon offset. So Eli, what can we say about this link between the voluntary markets and then the carbon removal itself?
Well, maybe going back to the question that you posed about what is offsetting, I think I often say that offsetting is the verb and carbon credits are the noun. So what we care about are carbon credits, potentially, sort of quantized units of, in this case, carbon removal. Of course, there are other types of carbon credits, which shall go unnamed. But carbon removal credits are these kind of exchangeable items that the CRCM, the carbon removal certification mechanism that Fabien's team is working on and other systems will allow us to generate. And they have many uses. You could use them, a country could use them to meet its NDC. Someone could choose to retire them and not claim any sort of net zero claim or anything. They could just sort of do that on a voluntary basis. It's only when you use a carbon credit to cancel out with a unit of emissions or claim to cancel it out, that's when you have engaged in the act of offsetting. And there's nothing necessarily good or bad about that. That's just a term that describes it. It so happens that I think there's a lot of baggage with the term offset as a noun, which is very frankly not really accurate, doesn't really make sense. But historically, there have been all these carbon credits that have been quite low quality, and we want to make sure that that doesn't occur again. So what can we say about the voluntary carbon market? It obviously has great strengths, and it can really help our mission of delivering our climate goals. And it also has potentially great weaknesses, because at the end of the day, it's a sort of free for all. And there's always this risk of a race to the bottom. So what I think what we like about the sustainable carbon cycles vision that the DG Clima unit has put out is that we conceive of the next several years as a kind of proving ground for carbon removal certification. If we can establish clear methodologies that define different types of carbon removal, people can try them out in the voluntary carbon market. What I think I'm most interested in delving into, maybe we can talk about it at some point later, is the role of marks and labels and sort of advertising regulation in products. Because I guarantee you, as soon as the CRCM comes out, as soon as these methodologies exist, companies will start selling products that say climate positive, carbon free, etc. And the job of advertising regulators is to protect consumers from sort of fraudulent claims. So I think that's the intersection for me between the voluntary carbon market, which is voluntary, and the kind of role of regulators in making sure that people aren't making sort of false claims and greenwashing.
So should we, do we think that after some point, the voluntary market and then the regulatory environment in Europe or other places should ultimately, as a vision, become, maybe one and the same? Eva, do you think it's something that is on the horizon?
I will first add to what Eli was talking about, the role of voluntary market. I think one very important role it has is that it's this testing ground or this place for piloting different new methodologies and solutions and methods, because we do know from how the regulatory markets are evolving, it's a very, very slow process. Establishing new legislation takes a long time, and then implementing it and so on. But what we've seen that adopting new methodologies in the voluntary markets takes a lot less time. And I think this flexibility that voluntary markets have, and then these learnings that can be later applied in compliance markets is something where the voluntary market really has an edge. And for that, it's a great tool. Plus, it always allows to go beyond what the compliance markets are doing. So it's kind of this dual role, I would say. It's this testing and piloting and being very flexible and fast, and then being able to fill the gaps and go beyond, which is, the compliance markets are big and slow and very different animals. So I think we need these two to make things work and really to bring everything together. When you talk about the two converging, I'm listening to experts, and someone that I very much respect recently said that he sees that by 2025 already, this wasn't in a European context, it was international conversation, there could be real convergence. We'll see how fast. It's clear there's going to be a convergence just because of how the climate policy is evolving and how the countries are more and more using carbon pricing and specifically emissions trading or carbon markets to address their emissions and also increase removals. So eventually there's going to be conversions. We also see, for example, definitely in Sweden, they are already relying on methodologies that Gold Standard will supply them to do some Article 6 transactions. I think I just read something similar about another country. So we see that the voluntary market providers are, this knowledge and this expertise that comes from this piloting and trying things out first will end up in compliance markets. So I see a convergence. I cannot give you a date. Yes, I wonder who can.
So yeah, 2025 maybe seems a bit seems early by all means. So Mark, do you see the same the vision yours and of Bellona regarding the complementary role between the compliance markets and voluntary markets? Yeah.
Well, so I see the existence of the voluntary carbon market as trying to go beyond what compliance markets are currently doing. But from a civil society perspective, I would say that the trust in the voluntary carbon market has been eroded significantly, by these unnamed credits that Eli was referring to, and to build that trust back is going to be extremely difficult. But there's also questions about whether or not there is the willingness to pay for a carbon removal, since carbon removal is ultimately quite difficult to achieve. To take CO2 out of the atmosphere and then durably store it, as you mentioned in the definition. That's actually quite difficult and quite expensive. But the willingness to pay for those activities, will it really be there, unless it's mandated? And then, of course, there's a lot of confusion in the voluntary market, whether it's unintentional or intentional. There's a lot of confusion about credits which are for reducing emissions and others which are for removing CO2. And not much is being done to handle this sort of separate outcome. And we often see credits being sold which are carbon removal or reduction credits being sold as one unit and then marketed as a removal. So that leads to companies claiming that, we've over offset, which means that we are now a carbon negative company, but that is false. They haven't necessarily removed more than they've emitted. And then there's also a challenge, which is for a credit, which is a reduction, there isn't so much of a liability when it comes to after that non-emission. Like if you don't emit CO2, you haven't emitted CO2 and that's it, that's the end of the story. If you're doing CO2 removal, then there needs to be some liability to ensure that there is a permanent storage. And can the voluntary carbon market really handle the permanence of CO2 storage, which is, ideally forever, so in perpetuity? Can that really be handled in a voluntary carbon market? So those would be the concerns that I would flag in terms of the voluntary carbon market's role when it comes to carbon removal.
Okay, no, thanks. So I think now we have, by this point in the conversation, clarity about what's carbon removal, hopefully, and the difference with offsets and the complementary role at the end. So what I get from your comments is that the voluntary market are more flexible and fast to implement and can allow for innovation and for pioneering work. And then you have at the end the compliance markets, which come to ground all this in regulation and facts and laws. So maybe that's a way to reach a kind of first conclusion in this discussion regarding the definition. I'd like to turn now on what's happening in the compliance space in the short term. So there's lots of activity going on right now in EU Commission under the Green Deal and more specifically a certification mechanism that's underway. So Fabien, could we have your view maybe on maybe not the whole Fit for 55 package and Green Deal, but what's the space of carbon removals in the Green Deal, and then what specifically do you have in mind for this year as a priority for this establishment of a certification mechanism by the EU?
Yeah, sure. So if we talk about carbon removal in the context of the Green Deal and the legislation that was proposed last year that we called Fit for 55, this is with a zoom on 2030 with objectives that are set for 2030, not for the very long term, not for 2050. And what kind of carbon removals we will have in 2030? It will be still mainly natural-based solutions to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So the idea is to increase natural sinks in Europe because the current trend is not very good. There is a decreasing trend in the absorption of carbon from our forest and our land in Europe, and we want to revert that. And we think that there is something to do with individual actions with promoting at farmer, at land manager, at forester level practices to increase the thing, so to support and to develop carbon farming practices to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So when we talk about Green Deal, when we talk about Fit for 55, by 2030, this is mainly about what I would call carbon farming practices, natural-based solutions, however you want to call it. On the longer term, of course, technological solutions will be very important. And we need today to prepare everything that we need for the future, because if we don't do anything today, we will be too late, because this solution, we will need them at scale shortly after 2030, 2035, already with significant quantities of removal, and we need to be prepared for that. And that's why the Commission is coming this year with the certification of carbon removal, because before any full integration of carbon removals in EU policies, we need to be very sure about the supply of the carbon removal. And as everybody, I think, agree today around this table, we need to know what is a good quality carbon removal. We need to do the distinction between good quality carbon removal and other type of carbon removal that we don't necessarily want in our compliance framework. So this is the first element. But there is also, when it's about a voluntary market, there is also some other initiatives of the European Commission and still related to the Green Deal that are looking at, for instance, corporate reporting. When a business wants to claim climate neutrality, what kind of reporting we need to ask for to be able to judge this claim. And we are trying to set some rules on that. We are trying to set some requirements. For instance, there is more and more about distinguishing what is the emission reductions, what is the carbon removal, and what is the use of offset to do the distinction between these three elements in some carbon neutrality or climate neutrality claims. And in this context, the certification of carbon removal will be, of course, very important for the carbon removal part. So what I can say is that today we want to put in place this certification scheme, this European framework for the certification of carbon removal that will bring transparency, that will bring criteria to judge how good is a carbon removal supplied by different projects or by different economic or activity operators. And we think that it's very relevant in the context of the voluntary carbon market also, because today there is a kind of confusion. As Mark said, it's not always very clear what is behind the offset. Is it really a carbon removal? Is it a net removal? Is it an emission reduction, emission avoidance, etc.? So we want to try to bring a bit of clarity on when it is about carbon removals. And of course, it's super important in the future when we'll start to establish some links between carbon removals and all the pillar of European climate policies. So we can, of course, think about the ETS. We can think about the future policies on land use in Europe. When you look at amendment proposed by European Parliament to the proposal of the Commission on the ETS, for instance, they are already thinking about adding some links to carbon removal, to have a better inclusion of BECCS and DACCS, or recognition of BECCS and DACCS in the ETS. For instance, that is not fully the case now. So a lot of things going on this at European level.
Okay, so I get this is a first step in a journey that for which we have a kind of end goal from a climate point of view, but not yet from exactly the means. So Eve, I mean, how do you see this as a first step? The certification mechanism. How do you see that driving the beginning of the process towards maybe having carbon removal in compliance markets?
I think it's really filling the gap that we have at the moment, because there's just there are some CDR methods where it's where we kind of have the tools, but we will need to establish them under the compliance markets. But CDR, it's such a wide space. Today I was thinking, like, even this idea of trying to squeeze it under technological and natural solutions, it feels similar to taking everything that we have on emission reductions and trying to squeeze those into these two buckets. It's really, really hard. So it's a really broad area, and it has developed so much in the recent years. It's not anymore just about certain well-known CDR methods. And because of that, obviously, we want to use all of that in achieving the climate goals. And to use all of this wide range of tools, we need to have clear rules, clear standards, accounting rules, additionality rules, all of that in place. Because only once we have that, we can see what really fits into the compliance market, what makes sense, like what types of removals. Fabien mentioned, for example, that BECCS and DACCS have been suggested by the Parliament to be included under ETS. That's a good example where, because these types of activities would kind of make sense there, because ETS covers fossil emissions, for example, and then that's the reason why it doesn't include any. There is no link between, for example, ETS and LULUCF, which is the land use change forestry regulation, because then there's this firewall between the fossil emissions and the nature-based emissions and removals. So when we have a certification mechanism in place, we can see what to include in compliance markets, also how this will evolve over time, because we will get better at different types of monitoring, reporting, and verification. We'll have better technologies to do that. And then there can be this plan, what's going to be in the regulatory market, what's going to be in the voluntary market. And for the voluntary market, it's so important to understand what is their playground. because I see often this question, okay, can we do this, or is this going to be covered by some policies already? And the more clarity policymakers, be it on national level or on the EU level, can provide, the more helpful it is to make clear, where, who can come in and scale up CDR.
Okay. Yeah. Please.
I really liked Eva's point about the kind of big umbrella or family of CDR techniques. And I think we have to make sure that, those outside of this community don't think that we build this cohesive certification system and then all of a sudden we press go and this market develops. Because as I see it, you've got a huge umbrella of CDR techniques or methods. And the first filter is, do we have sightlines on technique X, method X, getting to gigaton scale, billion-ton scale per year? And do we have sightlines on this method being safe and secure and not causing other harms, right? Now we've reduced our universe to still many different things: soils, kelp, DAX, BEX. And that family varies in cost so much. So I think we then have to do a further division, not by nature versus tech, perhaps, but by really by what type of policy will get it moving. And this is where I was so excited to see in the Working Group 3 report from the IPCC on Monday, a direct acknowledgement of what led to the dramatic reduction in the cost of renewables. Unprecedented, incredible. Greg Nemeth tells the story best, how solar got cheap. And the answer is innovation policy packages was their language. And I think that has two types. It's public funding for early stage exploration and R&D. And then it's deployment incentives. So a consistent payment, because I think as Fabien was alluding to as well, you can build a certification scheme, but the demand won't just appear out of nowhere for the higher cost techniques. And so you need to create that demand. And that kind of sustained support from something like a carbon contract for difference, as I think may be contemplated in the from the EU Innovation Fund, a fixed price that's paid every time you do an action over a long period of time. That's what gets people to build big infrastructure. And just to close, to kind of oversimplify, if that's the policy approach for one set of carbon removal methods, the ones that are a bit higher cost, a bit sort of unproven in certain ways, really related to scale, not in terms of the technique, but can it get big? The other family of carbon removal methods, particularly a lot of the land-based methods, it's going to be a lot of work on the MRV side, and particularly on the land tenure side. And I'm really interested in this idea of what kind of creative legal instruments can we use to make sure that when people store carbon in land, as Mark said, if you're not done when you remove the carbon from the air, you become a steward in perpetuity of the stored carbon. How do we ingrain in the land title and in the land tenure the requirement that that stewardship continue? And I was looking this morning that actually an analysis was done that in 22 out of 25 EU countries that were analyzed, you can, in the existing legal framework, put in place a conservation easement, which guarantees that the carbon in the farm or the carbon in the forest will stay there even when it's handed off to a new owner. So things like that. We're getting a little detailed here, but I'd love to explore that, because I think we have to have a different set of approaches for some CDR techniques that are cheaper, ready to go, and another set of approaches for those ones that need to follow that same pathway that the IPCC report showed that solar, wind, battery storage all followed.
Okay, thanks. And Mark, so I was also interested by the comments that the Parliament, some members of the Parliament are using these discussions with Fit for 55 and ETS to see how potentially there could be a link between these methods of CDR and then the ETS market. So do you see that as a possible future step in the roadmap in implementation of compliance ways to boost and to develop CDR?
Yeah, so I mean, for the role of the carbon removal certification mechanism more broadly in EU policy, for me, is as a prerequisite for any sort of integration into compliance mechanisms of any sort. So even in the effort sharing regulation or in the emission trading system, the CRCM is absolutely necessary to be able to quantify how much carbon we're actually removing, to implement these mechanisms of monitoring, reporting, and verification that you've been mentioning, but mostly to make sure that when 1 ton that is removed on the piece of paper is actually 1 ton that has been removed in reality. We need to make sure that that is as close to reality as possible, because things can get very complicated very quickly, especially during the timescales that we're talking about. And if 1 ton of removals is reversed, then effectively that is a nullification of that removal. So we need to make sure that we are well on top of those things before we start including it into mechanisms such as the ETS or the effort sharing regulation. So in the absence of a compliance mechanism such as the CRCM, ideally the best place to finance this would be in sort of a sandbox.
You're excited, puppy? Oh my goodness. Hello. I know.
So I think we have some interference. But...
No,
If you're not speaking, please put yourself on mute. Thank you.
oh yeah, my parents live down that.
Jason, see if you might be able to mute people yourself. Yeah. No.
Will do. Thanks.
Yeah. As the host.
I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, so we were on
Sandbox.
Yes,
sandbox,
exactly. Yes.
Innovation.
So in the absence of a sort of a certification mechanism, the best way at the moment to incentivize or to sort of provide financing to these projects is in a sandbox such as the Innovation Fund. So ideally what we would like is to have a separate stream inside the Innovation Fund where there's a pot of money that's dedicated for carbon removal projects, such as the one that we've seen in Stockholm, the Stockholm Exergy project, which recently got some money from the Innovation Fund to install CCS on a biomass combined heat and power plant. That's exactly where we should be financing these kinds of projects in the short run. And at the same time, using the Innovation Fund to fund these projects is a good way to also test the CRCM on these specific facilities, and then fine tune it to make sure that we're actually reporting all of the CO2 that's being stored and all of the emissions along the way. Because as much as carbon dioxide removal is about taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it permanently somewhere else, it's also about making sure that in the act of doing so, you're not emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere than you're actually storing. And this is a very important instrument to make sure that that happens.
Okay, so I guess there's a kind of consensus on the fact that this is the right first step in terms of launching the CDR into the world of future compliance markets. So I think we clarified that point. Maybe just to conclude on this section, Eli, what do you see happening elsewhere outside the EU jurisdiction, or maybe in some individual countries that would be also interesting to note in terms of short-term regulatory trends?
On the certification front?
Yes,
more broadly?
Yeah, more broadly on including CDR in future compliance markets, for example, in the UK.
Yeah, well, in the UK, there's kind of 3 streams that we're aware of. One is, there was already £100 million that was procured for greenhouse gas removal, as it's referred to in the UK. And the vast majority of that went to pilot projects, not unlike the way that the Innovation Fund funded the Stockholm Exergy project. And I want to say that's a great type of policy. But what a lot of CDR entrepreneurs have been telling us is that what they actually want is someone to buy their products, carbon removal credits, not so much to subsidize the first of a kind plant. And so there's an effort afoot in the UK to do a re-up of that 100 million, hopefully, and to potentially change the way it's deployed so that it's a little bit more accessible for sort of earlier stage developers, and so that it potentially, that's one. There's a second stream they're working on that's more what I'm referring to about this kind of ongoing deployment incentive. So they're considering in this greenhouse gas removals business models consultation, how should the UK government incentivize ongoing removals? And this has big implications for the large BECCS plant that's under consideration. Or rather, the plant exists. The question is, will they use it to remove carbon? That's a whole can of worms that we don't have time for today. And the third effort in the UK that's of interest is the Committee on Climate Change considering releasing guidance on how companies who use carbon credits should disclose. I think Fabien was mentioning this, and we're really pleased to see this, those of us who worked on the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, because that's exactly what we called for, which is companies should disclose exactly what types of carbon credits they're using to make the net zero claim. And as Mark said, some of them are already claiming net zero despite not using exclusive removal credits. So those are the three streams in the UK. In the US, there's something called the carbon negative shot, which is a massive deployment of resources to help foster new carbon removal methods. Of course, I think most people are already familiar with what's happening in California with the low carbon fuel standard. And I think on certification in the voluntary carbon market, there's all kinds of efforts afoot. There's Puro, of course, there's C Capsule, there's CCS Plus. There's all kinds of individuals making their own methodologies or applying them to the gold standard and VERAS. So there's a lot happening. And there's also some interesting efforts afoot in Luxembourg and Ireland that the Open Air Collective has been spearheading, which we find really exciting. There's a whole host of stuff going on.
Okay, good to see that.
Add to that.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned Ireland and Luxembourg, but there's also Sweden. So the Stockholm Exergy project obviously in Stockholm. So while they get some of their funding from the Innovation Fund, the Swedish government has the way that it handles its climate plan is there's 90% of the net zero goal is emission reductions, and then they give themselves 10%, which is so-called supplementary measures, which have to be on top of those 90% reductions. And within those supplementary measures, there are projects like BECCS. And so they, like bio-CCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And the intention is to use reverse auctions to try and get additional funding to these facilities, but outside of any sort of offsetting scope. It's really just providing them with money to be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And this could be a really effective way, again, in the short term, or maybe even in the longer term, to complement innovation funds financing. To really sort of get the EU to help out a little bit, but then get the member states to sort of co-fund these projects in a way which is separate from emission reductions to make sure that both happen at the same time.
Okay, great. So I want to switch gear to the final sequence of this discussion and maybe going a bit longer term, let's say 2050, which is still almost 30 years away, but not so far in the distance in terms of infrastructure. So let's do a quick mental exercise and jump to 2050. So I'd be interested to have your views on where we are, in terms of CDR deployment in Europe. Where has this conversation led us 30 years later? Who wants to have a first shot? Maybe Fabien?
Yeah, well, I can say a few words on that because we did a lot of modeling on this, and it's very difficult to tell you exactly how much we will rely on carbon removal by 2050. But what is sure is that by 2050 we'll still have some residual emissions, and we want to be climate neutral. So we need to neutralize these emissions with carbon removals. And when you look at the results of our modeling, well, it depends very much about assumptions that you are doing on the uptake of some technologies, also on behavior of people from the demand side. Are we going to live the same kind of way that we are living today, or are we going to have different behaviors, etc.? But in any scenario, you need carbon removals, and you need to capture carbon from the atmosphere, and you do need to do something out of this carbon. So either you store it or you reuse it. And this is also the big question. By 2050, from all the CO2 that we are going to capture, let's say between 300 million tons of CO2, 500 million tons of CO2 in some scenarios, maybe more in some extreme scenarios, what are we going to do with this CO2? Is it better to put it in the ground to generate negative emissions? And when you do it with BECCS, you produce energy on the top of that, or do you think it's better to capture the CO2 and to reuse it in a kind of new circular economy? And I think this is also a key point and a very important point to discuss and to see if we can replace fossil carbon with the more sustainable sources of carbon in all the sectors of our economy that needs carbon. So depending on the scenario, when you think that one will develop more than the others, you can have a very different level of carbon removals. But for sure, you will need some carbon removals. You will need a LULUCF. Well, our forest and land sink should be maintained and enhanced. and the demand on the capturing carbon is huge. So yes, definitely, I think this is a sector that will only grow in the future.
Okay, who else have? Thanks, Fabien. So who else have thoughts on 2050? How do you see things?
Yeah, maybe building on what Fabien mentioned. So we'll have these residual emissions. And I think this is the big question mark. We all know that there are going to be residual emissions. Often we mention the main sectors where these are going from, for example, aviation, maritime transport, agriculture. But there's no common agreement exactly what these residual emissions are if we go on the sector and company level. So we're talking about residual emissions, we're talking about hard to abate emissions, difficult to abate emissions, impossible to abate emissions. Sometimes I would call them, in some case, like inconvenient to abate if they're just expensive, right? And I think it would be useful to develop that concept a bit better on the pathway to implementing all these different CDR policies, so that there would be this clarity and understanding who actually gets to keep emitting and who should not claim that, well, we did our best and now we are offsetting the rest, but what is the best? Where does it get us? I think hopefully by 2050 that has all been cleared up. That would be my wish for 2050.
Okay, Eli, how do you see things?
Well, I think what was so striking, another thing that was striking to me about the IPCC report that just came out is, it couldn't have been clearer that the carbon budget, the amount of carbon we have left to emit and still stay within 1.5 degrees of peak warming, is already exhausted just with existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure. So we're done. Any more carbon that we emit on top of that, we need to be planning to remove. And for me, if I'm sitting in 2050 and I'm looking backwards, well, first of all, in 2050, regardless of what those residual emissions are, because the definition of residual emissions will change as technologies change and policies change. There will be some residual emissions, yes. But no matter what, in 2050, we need to be geared up and ready to be removing tens of gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere every year from then onward. And this will be a massive industry. This will create all kinds of benefits to the environment, to livelihoods, et cetera. But it is a responsibility we'll have to ensure a safe climate. And so that means sitting in 2050 and looking back the, 27 and a half years, what we did in those 27 and a half years is the following. We created airtight certification mechanisms like the CRCM to clearly define what good carbon removal is. We made sure that we built the mechanisms to track the sources and destinations of carbon, whether they be biogenic, fossil, atmospheric. We created demand for those credits through policies that put money into carbon removal projects on sort of a demand basis. And we did that early so that the costs of the higher cost carbon removal technologies came down in time. So I think there's kind of a clear set of tasks we have to do over the next 27 years. And there's no situation in which we aren't removing, I'm unwilling to accept any situation because it means we've failed our climate goals that doesn't involve removing, IPCC says something on the order of 5 to 16 gigatons per year in 2050. So it's an audacious goal, but it's an exciting one. And I think we have some sense of what we have to do to get there.
And maybe I can add just one point, sorry for that, because I think it's important. And you talk about 2050 and in the climate, it's set in the climate law by 2050, we want to be climate neutral, but doesn't stop there, because in the climate law, you have also the end of the sentence that is saying, and we should aim to being negative emissions after 2050. So carbon, we will need that carbon anyway, carbon removals to reach this secondary objective of the climate law.
Yeah. So when you close your eyes, Mark, and you think about 2050, are we on the way to become a carbon negative economy in Europe at least?
Well, I guess one of the key words is climate neutrality, which is not the same as carbon neutrality, because climate neutrality includes all greenhouse gases. So effectively, if you want to be climate neutral by 2050, we should probably be carbon negative a little bit before then, or very close to then. So that's one of the key points that we should be bearing in mind, is that we need negative emissions, not just for CO2 emissions, residual CO2 emissions, but also for non-CO2 greenhouse gases. But also to bring us back a little bit on the hard to abate point, that some sectors which had been considered hard to abate, like steel and cement and chemicals, do actually have the option of doing CCS. It's just that they've considered CCS to be sort of undesirable. But once CCS is on the table, then these hard to abate sectors suddenly become easy to abate sectors, and could actually turn into carbon sinks if the feedstock is changed to a sustainable supply of biomass with CCS. That could then turn those hard to abate sectors into carbon sinks. And so something that's quite important to remember as well is that on the pathway to 2050, the less we emit on that pathway to 2050, the less we need to remove CO2 to be able to make up for what we haven't reduced. And the more that we remove will actually bring us back down to much safer levels or safer, less dangerous levels of warming.
Okay, so I think these are notes of optimism for the future. Jason, maybe it would be good if we take a few minutes to address some Q&A or questions that might have come during the conversation.
Sure. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes left. So a couple of questions came in. One question about how do we take care of double counting? How do we, thoughts on how to make sure that the same removal doesn't get claimed by different entities?
Well, I wanted to touch on a slightly different but very topical, like the same double counting issue, not necessarily of counting a removal twice, but counting an emission reduction twice. So, for example, in context of CO2 utilization, there's this discussion at the moment about who should get the credit for using the CO2 more than once, and thereby potentially displacing another fossil CO2 molecule. And the discussion today is, or the status quo is that CO2 that is used in the CO2 that is from the ETS and that is used is counted as emitted in the ETS. And that's a very clear way to avoid double counting, because it makes sure one facility is responsible for that CO2 molecule from the moment it takes it out, from the moment it's in the atmosphere. And there are these discussions at the moment to take this liability downstream towards the sector that is consuming the CO2. But that would be a clear risk of double counting, in the sense that the CO2 would then go out of the ETS system and go into another system which is not currently regulated, and would also make it impossible for any products which use CO2 to actually claim the carbon reduction, since that reduction is now being claimed in the ETS. So that's an issue with double counting that needs to be handled in the current discussions on the emission trading scheme.
Yeah, maybe to add just a little bit, I think, on a very practical, technical level, we've already solved the double counting problem in our financial systems, largely speaking, right? Banks maintain databases of transactions, so when you spend money, it can't get spent twice. And I think we can also learn a lot from Eva's home country of Estonia, which has implemented all kinds of incredible distributed ledger technologies to maintain data. So we have the tools to do that. So I think Mark is spot on, that it's all about the upfront logic of making sure that we're not designing a system in such a way that multiple attributes can be claimed multiple times. But the way I think of it is there's different ways to account. Accounting is a human construct, right? There's last in, last out, first in, first out. Accounting involves human decisions. So there are different ways to account for carbon. One way is on a geographic basis. Where do the emissions physically happen and where do the removals physically happen? And that's where climate trace and other efforts to kind of digitize and collate live climate data around the world are really amazing. So there's that kind of geographic based accounting. And that's one system where you definitely want to make sure that there's no double counting there, that's all accounted for. There's another way of looking at the world, which is based on economic entity. So which individuals and corporates are responsible for which emissions. And so you can simultaneously have both of those ways of looking at the world. And as long as each one adds up to zero, you've achieved net zero. But what gets dangerous is when we start to mix and match, and we have issues like, international air travel that's not accounted for within European emissions. So it's kind of these almost like stranded emissions that no one's really responsible for. Likewise, when we have Earth system feedbacks and warming causes more emissions, who's responsible for those emissions? So double counting is a problem to solve. We have the tools to do it. I'm actually more concerned about not counting emissions that are kind of emissions and removals that are kind of out there that aren't being tied and attributed to either a specific country or a specific economic entity.
Great. One other question here before we conclude. Martin Vandenberg asked, what kind of pricing on carbon capture do you think is financially viable for the industry to commit to CDR? How much should the market be subsidized? I got a bit of a different, maybe a little bit different take on that question myself, is that, I mean, knowing that, Sweden has a carbon tax of, last I checked, maybe 114 euro, and, lately on the ETS, carbon is trading at, 80 euro per ton. How, do you see, which mechanisms do you see happening at a state level for like an overall carbon tax? What level, what price, clearing price in an ETS would be, would be most financially viable? Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, on the price point,
from a like carbon tax, carbon pricing perspective.
Yeah. I mean, is an overall carbon, think about like an overall carbon price of like $100, 100 euro per ton. Is that, what's the, is there an optimal price point for carbon to reach in any of these policy?
Well, so relying on simply a carbon price would probably not be enough, in the sense that it would probably not be able to capture a lot of the infrastructural costs. So, for example, when we're looking at individual point sources, this is what I was mentioning earlier, that when you look at CCS, there's the capture, there's the transport, and there's the storage. And when you look at those on a per facility basis, the capture generally looks like the most expensive, because that's the one that is, for each facility. Whereas the transport and the storage will be shared infrastructure between multiple facilities. And none of these facilities will be particularly excited to pay for that infrastructure themselves. So having a price, just a price on its own, is unlikely to really cause or to sort of generate enough finances to support the creation of this infrastructure more widely.
Got it. Thanks. So we're just about at time. Just want to say thanks to the panel for an excellent discussion, and thanks to you, our audience, as well, for your questions. And regrettably, we weren't able to get to them all, but that's what AirMiners is for, to ask questions and push the conversation to new heights. I would want to share a couple of things. First, I'm going to share the we have a post-event survey for people to share their comments and concerns about today's event. We love to hear feedback. We love to hear about more. I would also say that we are going to have a new event in a week's time on mine tailings in carbon removal. How this new field of mineralization, specifically regarding mines, are going to be used. Panel, any last thoughts? Any questions, comments, concerns yourselves?
I would say maybe if there's one thing to remember about carbon dioxide removal, it's reduce as much as you can and remove the rest.
Yes, we need to go away from, to build on that, just adaptation and mitigation, to reduce, remove, and adapt. So even at the UN level, and there's an effort afoot to do this, we need to change and legitimize those three pillars. Love that point.
So reduce, remove, and adapt, Jason. That's the last words, I guess.
Okay. All right. And we are going to adapt as well. We're going to stop the recording now and say thank you to everyone for an excellent discussion, and we'll see you next time.